This is Christmas Car Kerfuffle, Episode 3. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Chapter 4. The snow was falling more heavily. The windshield wipers were on a steady back and forth to keep the view of the snow-covered State Route 99 and 15 clear. Still, Blythe's attention was so much more focused on the man beside her. He kissed her. Wow, an amazing kiss. Hot. She wouldn't have expected the heat from Zayden, who was about as steady of a man as there ever was. Ken was serious with a hot temper. Zayden always had an easy smile and a relaxed way of doing things. Even today, when the car mix-up had occurred, he'd not gotten flustered. Even when he thought the car was stolen, he'd stayed calm. It was a trait she admired deeply. She didn't touch her lips, although they still tingled, even now that it had been almost an hour since he'd kissed her. He hadn't said much of anything, seeming to act like the ball was in her court now, which she supposed it was. He'd said he'd wanted to kiss her. She'd said she was confused. It was up to her to correct the misinformation. She wasn't confused, not about Zayden and what she felt. She just wasn't sure how that would all look. To his parents, to hers, to everyone. Like she was replacing one brother with the other, the one she should have chosen to begin with. Ken had been smoother, more mature, a doctor for goodness sake, and Zayden had been comfortable, a little immature to her, since she was a woman of the world and he was just a recent high school grad. She should have looked deeper. The snow lay in thick white lines on the road. He drove with confidence. Not too fast, but he didn't creep along either, passing the more cautious drivers in the right-hand lane. That would be her. The steep, mountainous drop-offs were numerous along the way, and she didn't trust the flimsy-looking guardrails to keep them clinging to the side of the mountains. But she did trust Zayden. He goofed and spun a donut in the back parking lot before pulling out of the restaurant, making Grandpap hoot with glee from the back seat, but he'd had a steady hand since. Currently, he had one hand on the wheel and one resting on the shifter between them. She studied it, the fingers long but blunt-ended, calloused on the sides, black grease stuck under the nails, which she knew from experience with Rand would only come out if she scrubbed with a stiff-bristled brush or cut it out. Either way was painful for a small boy. A man would probably find it equally unpleasant. Zayden hadn't had enough time to scrub his nails today, though. A thick wrist, bones and sinews moving under a dark tan, fanned out into a muscular forearm. He wore a t-shirt, having taken his long-sleeve tee off and stuffed it under his seat so he wouldn't be too hot with the heater on. She appreciated the consideration, since she was still in her winter jacket. Although her neck heated under her collar at the thought of his hands and how carefully they'd held her, how capable they were. They were about an hour away from the restaurant, and judging from the snores coming from the back, both Graham and Grandpap were taking their early evening pre-nap nap. What would he do if she settled her hand over his? She bit her lip and looked back out her window into the falling darkness. Pretty soon, and she wouldn't be able to tell how deep the ravines were. She pulled her hand out from under her purse and set it on her leg, eyeing his hand again on the shifter. He'd basically told her he'd had a crush on her for a long time. No, he'd told her he wanted to kiss her for a long time, which wasn't really the same thing. Was it? She didn't know. Even though her divorce had been final for 2 years, it had been so long since she'd felt free to look or even think about someone other than Ken. She'd been busy with her children. She was still busy with her children, but Zayden had been helping her. Had he wanted to kiss her this past 4th of July? She had been glad for the darkness that covered any trace of expression on her face as he fed her the s'mores. She definitely spent more than a few minutes thinking of kissing him. There were not many cars left on the road. Most sensible people didn't try to cross mountains in snowstorms. If only the presents for her children weren't in the trunk of her car, she would tell him to turn around. Something told her, though, that he would make sure the presents got to her children on Christmas. Her heart warmed at the thought. And she lifted her hand, setting it down over his, feeling the warmth and roughness. His head jerked, his gaze first looking at their touching hands, then shifting up to her eyes. His own were wide, surprised, unsure. His brows lifted. Despite the trembling in her stomach, she smiled, a little question keeping her lips from turning up too much. He grinned, full on, back at her. His hand flipped under hers, and he threaded his fingers with hers. She looked at their hands, woven together. "That looks right to me," she heard herself say. "It feels right to me," his deeper voice echoed. I wanted to kiss you before, too," she whispered. "But you thought I was gay," he said with a slight edge to his voice. She looked down at her hands. "I was too afraid to ask." "I scare you?" "No, not that kind of fear. The kind where—" She took a deep breath. It wasn't comfortable to open oneself and show the parts, as Zayden had put it. "Where your husband left you for another woman, and it makes you wonder what's wrong with you and what you did that caused him to leave, and whether anyone could ever see anything good in you again." His fingers tightened around hers. "Makes me want to punch my brother. Although, I have to admit his leaving you gave me the first hope I've had in years." She grunted, not quite a laugh. "I wouldn't want you to go through that pain just for me, though." "It was necessary, I think. He never really wanted me to begin with." Zayden's lips tightened, but he didn't argue. Blythe had been Ken's rebound relationship after his college sweetheart broke up with him. "I was kind of enamored with the whole doctor thing, and just kind of in awe of him." "I noticed," Zayden said with a little irony. "I can't believe you thought about me." "You were nice to our mom, who wasn't, and still isn't, easy to get along with. And I admired the way you took care of your Gram. Still do. In fact, I think you showed up at our house for your first meal with our family with your Gram in tow. That really impressed me." She looked over at him, shocked. "Ken was mad at me for a week over that." Zayden shrugged. "I guess we've always valued different things." "You're actually a lot different than the rest of your family." He chuckled. "I guess what they say about the second child wanting to be different than the first was applicable in our case." "But your mom is so—" Blythe waved her other hand, looking for a word. A nice word. "Highbrowed," Zayden suggested. "I suppose. I kind of felt she was relieved when Ken divorced me." Flashing lights shone through the darkness up ahead. Zayden took his foot off the gas and the car slowed naturally. He looked over at Blythe. "I hope this," he held up their linked hands, "is something I get to talk to my mother about." Blythe studied the lights as they drew closer. It looked like the road ahead was closed at the exit. "I hate to admit it, but that was the main source of my hesitation. I shouldn't care what other people will think, but I did worry some about your mother." His father was happily married to his fourth wife and living in California. In all the years she'd been with Ken, she'd only met him once. At least she didn't have to worry about him. Zayden studied the traffic ahead, pulling off the exit and motoring slowly down it. So, does this, he held up their hands again, mean that you decided it was worth it? Yes, she said softly. So, you're with me. Is that what you want? Yeah, more than anything. What a time for him to finally declare his feelings. Well, he hadn't exactly declared all his feelings. It was probably too soon to tell her he loved her and had loved her for a very long time. But he wasn't sure where they were or where they were going, now that they'd been directed to get off the interstate. Would you mind trying to figure out how to get around? I assumed it's an accident and the whole road isn't shut down. It's not that bad out. Blythe looked at the road like she might argue, but she didn't. Instead, she grabbed her phone from her purse and began scrolling through. The car 100 yards ahead of them turned right, so he turned right too, since there was a big truck coming down the ramp behind them, and he didn't want to sit at the stop sign hoping it didn't jackknife into them. At least the snores coming from the back indicated that Gram and Grandpap were still asleep. He wouldn't mind just stopping and holding Blythe for a while, finding out where the newness of their relationship would take them. Maybe find some mistletoe. I'm getting the map app up, but I only have 1 bar of service, so it's slow. That's fine, he said. The road they were on hadn't been plowed in a while, and the lines were covered under an inch of snow. Just another 15 miles and we'd have been out of the mountains, he commented. There probably weren't a ton of roads that would take them north through the mountains. Anywhere else, and there'd be roads crisscrossing everywhere. He'd be pretty confident about finding one that would work. But here? We lost? Grandpap's voice came from the back seat. I've managed to lose 2 cars already today. I suppose it's not out of the realm of possibility. Zayden slowed as the road took a hairpin left turn. I'm glad it's dark, Gram said. Her voice sounded a little shaky. But Blythe laughed. Me too. I'm afraid of heights. Are you really? He asked, surprised. He hadn't known that about her. Yep. But you rode the roller coaster at the amusement park this summer. I shut my eyes as soon as it started up the hill and didn't open them until it pulled back into the station. He laughed. You must have had your eyes closed earlier, too. Those are some sharp drop-offs back there. Here, too, Grandpap said ominously from the back. For some reason, it sent a shiver through Zayden, but he shrugged like he hadn't felt a thing. That's okay. This car must have been built by an Eskimo, because it drives like a dream in the snow. This is definitely a good car for the snow, Blythe murmured, distracted because of looking at her phone. I'm sorry, there just isn't any service. Well, then we'll drive until we get service or until we find a place to stop and ask for directions. You'll stop and ask for directions? Blythe asked, shocked. Sure. Why not? It'd be kind of dumb not to do it in weather like this with no cell service. How much gas do we have? Gram asked from the back. Grandpap shushed her. There was just enough light from the dash for Zayden to see Grandpap take her hand. He tried to get Blythe's attention by looking over at her. When she looked up at him, he jerked his head back and put a finger to his lips. She twisted inconspicuously, and her face split into a smile when she saw their hands. She gave him the thumbs up. He nodded and looked back at the road. They had almost 3/4 of a tank, so they should be good. But he'd feel a lot better once they were out of the mountains. Chapter 5. It was an hour before Blythe had enough signal on her phone for a long enough time to get the map app to work. "I think we're actually headed in the right direction. It says an hour until we get to our destination." One side of Zayden's mouth curved up into a lopsided smile, the one she loved. "That's just peachy. How soon until we get to a gas station? I need to stop," Graham said from the back seat. Blythe studied the map. "Can you wait maybe 30 minutes? "If I have to," Graham said a little belligerently. She always got testy when she was out past her bedtime. Even though it wasn't late, only 7, it was still past time for Graham to be winding down for the night. They were in and out of service, but Blythe could follow the directions without any trouble, and it didn't feel like too long until they came to a small mom-and-pop gas station. Zayden pulled up to the front door. "I'll just stay here in the car until someone else comes out." Blythe laughed. "Learned your lesson, did you?" She helped Graham in, then he helped Grandpap out. Blythe wasn't sure exactly what she was kind of hoping for. A little private exchange, a stolen kiss, a touch of his hand? Not sure, but she hung around while Zayden walked in, then walked back out with him. He gave her a smile, but she had kind of wanted more. What were they to each other? It wasn't a question she could talk to him about with Graham and Grandpap in the back. Still, she wasn't going to let her thoughts bother her. She wasn't going to second-guess all the things he'd said. Ken hadn't been satisfied with her, but Zayden was a completely different story. Zayden was buckling his seatbelt when his phone rang. He looked at the number, then glanced at her. Was that guilt pinching his face? A sliver of unease rippled through her, but there was no denying he answered his phone and turned toward the window. "Hello?" he said softly. She shouldn't listen, she really shouldn't, but she couldn't help it. "No, not tonight." "Yeah, tomorrow. We'll see." He glanced over at her. She jerked her head down like she was looking at her phone, only it was blank because she didn't have it on at all. "I'll call you tomorrow sometime." "Yes, we'll get it." "Okay. Have a good evening. Bye." He pressed the red button on his phone, clicked and swiped a couple more times. She couldn't be sure, but she thought he was erasing the record of the call, then threw his phone in the cup holder. "Everyone ready to head out of here?" he asked, looking over at her, then into the rearview mirror. That sounded mysterious. Blythe tried to sound unconcerned, but she was nosy, and yes, after Ken, she was insecure. Zayden wasn't anything like his brother, but for some reason, maybe because having a relationship with him was a huge step for her, she needed that little reassurance. "That was probably his lady friend, admirer, whatever you want to call her," Grandpap said from the back seat. "Huh?" Zayden said. Blythe couldn't decide if he was truly confused or just trying to hide something. He shifted into reverse. "You know, that girl that's always calling you." Grandpap's voice got low and conspiratorial. "You better snatch him up, Blythe girl. That other woman has been trying to sink her claws into him for almost a year now." "That's enough, Grandpap," Zayden said curtly. "Testy," Grandpap said gruffly from the back seat, but he didn't say anything more. By 8 o'clock, they pulled into a nice house in an upscale subdivision where Blythe's car sat, pulled off to the side of the driveway. An older lady came out to meet them, but they didn't chat long. Zayden apologized and told her there was no bill for the work he'd done. They moved their few things. Blythe helped Graham in, and Zayden opened the door for Grandpap. The snow had thinned out some, but it was still coming down. "Do you want me to drive?" Zayden asked. "Do you mind?" "I like driving." "Even in snow?" "Especially in snow." He grinned. Let's pop the trunk and just make sure that everything is in there. Relief flooded through her chest.
You read my mind. I thought I was being paranoid.
He started the car and flicked the latch for the trunk. They met at the back of the car. All the gifts she'd gotten were in the back, just like she'd left them.
This just made my day.
Zayden turned to face her. That kiss from earlier made mine. He moved a little closer, and she breathed in his spicy, working man scent. I've been having an argument with myself most of the way here about whether it was actually as good as I thought it was. Part of me says no kiss could have been that good.
Really? Through the snow and the dark and the roads and being lost, you weren't actually thinking about all of that, but rather trying to figure out my kiss?
Yep. He shoved one hand in his pocket and leaned a hip against the edge of her trunk. The only thing that's going to give me any peace at all on the way home is if you kiss me again, so I can know for sure how good it was.
Oh, now I have to kiss you for your peace of mind.
That's right. She stepped closer, a little smile tugging the corners of her mouth up. She liked this more playful, flirting side of Zayden. He was always smiling but didn't usually tease her. He typically treated her with kid gloves. It was nice the gloves had finally come off.
I wouldn't want you to be upset if it's in my power to fix it.
She leaned closer, her lips almost brushing him as she spoke. She'd meant to tease him some, but the lightning bolts that shot down her back and through her stomach were wreaking havoc with her good plans. Kind of you. His lips did brush hers. A little moan slipped out of her mouth. It drove him into action. His lips caught hers, his hands pulled her closer, his body curled around her. Heat exploded in waves of color behind her closed eyes. She pressed closer, her hands touching his curled hair, before thrusting into it, cradling his neck, tugging him closer still. This time, he was the one who pulled back, his breath coming in short gasps, his eyes still half closed. She hadn't wanted to release him, but she still had enough of her brain functioning that she knew they couldn't stand behind her car and make out all night. Her hands slipped out of his hair, wandering down across his broad shoulders, feeling the ridges of his muscles under his tee, catching the ripple as her hands moved lower, down the hard ribs of his back and following the line of his narrowing waist. He captured both of her hands in his, threading their fingers together, dropping another couple of kisses on her forehead and cheeks.
Which side of you won?
She whispered. Neither. He laughed. Neither of them were even close to being right about how good kissing you is. He laughed again. I'm going to stand up here in a minute and shut your trunk, just as soon as my knees stop feeling like they're filled with used motor oil instead of bones. She laughed, still a little shaky herself.
Maybe when we get home we can practice some more.
He looked down into her laughing face, his own expression completely serious. I don't think I can take too much more practicing. He ran a hand through his longish hair and sighed a wobbly sigh. But I could definitely help you wrap these gifts so they're still ready like you planned. I'll just have to drop Gram and Grandpap off first. She waved a hand.
You don't have to do that.
I want to.
I'm not going to turn down help.
She took a breath, feeling almost ready to try standing on her own again. Zayden's kissing was powerful. His ringtone rang out. If she hadn't been leaning against him, she might have missed the look that passed over his face. Almost like panic. He quickly covered it, pulling his phone out and giving her a superficial smile. A thread of suspicion snaked around her backbone, joining with the uneasy feeling left from the last phone call he had. I need to get this. He waved his phone. Then I'll be ready to go. He didn't quite meet her eye, just like Ken before he left her. She narrowed her eyes, but Zayden had already turned and walked away from the car. Chapter 6. Zayden took another sip of his coffee as he pulled away from his house after walking Grandpap up the stairs. The bitter taste nipped at his tongue, but he needed it to make the drive home. He glanced over at Blythe. She sat with her head back, eyes closed, although he was pretty sure she wasn't asleep. Just quiet. Had been the whole way home, and he wasn't sure why, but he was hoping she was just tired. She'd clammed up after their kiss, though, and he was a little worried about that.
Thanks for walking Gram in when you dropped her off.
Blythe's voice startled him. He pulled into her driveway. No problem. She's just as sharp as ever. I think our matchmaking really worked today.
I think you're right.
She lifted her head and unbuckled her seatbelt.
You don't have to come in. It won't take long at all to wrap these.
Her tone was cool and aloof. She really sounded like she didn't want him in. Hopefully it was just from the long day. After all, it was nearly 3 a.m. Unless you kick me out, I'm coming in and helping. It's my fault this isn't done already.
We already had that argument.
And I won, he said with one lip lifted. They got out of the car, Blythe going to unlock the door, Zayden heading to the trunk to carry some gifts in. The snow had stopped after they crossed south of I-80, like it often did, and although the pavement was damp from a light drizzle, it wasn't frozen. He still walked in carefully, balancing several larger packages in his arms, along with carrying several bags in both hands. Blythe had plugged her tree in and several strings of lights. She stood at the piano lighting a candle, slim and beautiful, her hair falling down her back, her green sweater falling casually over her worn jeans. Zayden admired the sight until she turned.
Oh, she said. Here, you can set those things down in front of the couch.
She helped relieve him of his burden, setting the gifts down.
If you don't mind, I thought we'd wrap them in here beside the tree. Normally, I drag a table in when Gram helps, but I sit on the floor.
Sounds good to me.
Great. I'll grab my box of paper and accessories and be back in a sec.
He watched her walk out of the room, the glow from the Christmas tree lights reflecting in her hair. She was being nice, but standoffish. Well, he'd waited a long time to kiss her. He wasn't going to waste any more time wondering what the issue was. He'd just ask. But she came back and immediately started giving directions. He wasn't the best rapper in the world, and he had to listen carefully since she wrapped Rand's gifts in 3 colors and Lottie's gifts in another, so they didn't know whose were whose until Christmas morning.
It's awful when you get them confused,
she said with a self-effacing grin.
I did it one year and Lottie opened one of Rand's gifts. It was all he talked about all day to anyone who would listen, how Lottie had opened one of his presents. You'd have thought it was the only one he got.
Actually, I think I remember that year. My parents were home and you and Ken brought the kids over for an evening dinner. He laughed. I remember Rand talking about it, and you didn't look very happy. She snorted as she used the scissors to cut the paper.
It was Ken who screwed up. I'm sure I wasn't very happy with him.
She shook her head and ripped off a piece of tape.
Looking back, it was such a little thing. So dumb to get upset about it.
She had turned the Christmas music on low, and it filled the silence. Unspoken was the idea that there were bigger things to get upset about, like a little boy and girl who wouldn't have their daddy with them on Christmas this year. My parents texted me yesterday. Their plane arrived safely in Acapulco. Her lip pulled back.
Ken called to talk to the kids. I didn't really talk to him, but he'll probably call the kids on Christmas. At some point.
Zayden swallowed. He focused on creasing the paper so it folded over perfectly. He pressed a piece of tape down. I'm not very good with bows and ribbons. You want to do that?
You go ahead. The kids aren't going to notice anyway. I just like to see the pretty presents under the tree. I'll probably sit for a while after the kids go to bed tonight and admire it.
You should come down to the live nativity at the Methodist church down by the river. I'll be Joseph.
Sounds cold.
He laughed as he cut a length of green ribbon. The sweet scent of the spicy candle she'd lit drifted over and mixed with her cinnamon and vanilla smell. He had to remind himself he was wrapping presents because he wanted to be distracted. Yeah, it'll be cold. Lots of long underwear under the robe.
I don't think Joseph wore long underwear.
He is tomorrow night. They laughed together.
I'll bring the kids by. Probably my mom and Graham, too. What is Pap doing? I could get him.
Somehow, he finagled his way into being in charge of handing out the hot chocolate inside the nice, warm church basement. If you ask nicely, he'll probably sneak you coffee if you want it.
Hot chocolate is perfect.
He held his gift up. The bow was lopsided, but his wrap job was pretty neat.
Nice, she said, glancing up.
He set the wrapped present under the tree, then slowly leaned back. It had been bothering him for a while, and he figured the best thing to do was just flat out ask. You seemed a little upset at me earlier. Was I imagining it? Blythe kept her hands busy and didn't look up.
Should I have been upset?
He noticed she didn't exactly answer the question, which, in his experience, probably meant she actually was upset. No. He gave his honest answer. Then, because it was late and he didn't want to keep her up because she had to be tired, he grabbed another gift and started wrapping. She allowed the silence to lengthen. Finally, he prompted her. I think the problem must have had to do with me kissing you. Were you regretting it? Her face shot up. No, she said, almost breathlessly. Good. His mouth twisted up, and the ache in his chest eased. That had been his biggest fear. I'm kind of hoping I'll get to do it a lot more. Her head was down as she tied a neat gold bow on her gift, but he could see her lips lift. Another good sign. Help me out, please. If I did something to offend you, tell me. I promise I won't get upset. I'd like to fix it. She didn't answer right away, and he grabbed the last present and began wrapping it. The music purred softly in the background, and he tried to stop thinking about what the issue might have been and just focus on enjoying a peaceful and romantic evening with the woman he'd admired for a long time. By the time she was done wrapping, she still hadn't said anything. She set it neatly under the tree and admired the picture the gifts made for a moment before standing. Zayden put the lid on her box of Christmas paper and ribbon and followed her up. So, you're not telling me? He stepped closer. She bit her lip and looked at the tree.
You got 2 phone calls and you just looked guilty when you answered them.
Her head tilted up and her eyes drilled into his.
How many women do you have strung out on your line?
I'm only angling for one, he murmured, surprised. She had to be talking about the 2 phone calls he'd gotten from Rand. And she was right. He couldn't tell her about them. I haven't had a woman outside of the family call me on my cell phone for so long, I bet I couldn't even dig up a number on it. She crossed her arms over her chest. The defensive posturing reminded him that Ken had given her good reason to be suspicious of men. He shoved a hand through his hair and blew out a breath. But you're right. I really don't want to tell you who called me.
I don't care, she said.
I want you to care, he responded. She shrugged.
You can have 100 women calling you every day. Fine with me. I just have issues with kissing a man who doesn't limit his girls to one at a time.
It's not one at a time. It's just one. She had to believe him, but her lips pressed together and her arms stayed crossed.
It's fine, Zayden. It's not like you owe me fidelity after we exchanged a kiss or two.
She dropped her hands and turned away.
I just don't want to make a habit of it.
I can't tell you who called. He touched her arm and she stopped, her back toward him. But I promise you it wasn't a woman. She looked over her shoulder with a raised brow. No. He rolled his eyes and pulled. She turned to face him. No, it wasn't a boyfriend either. Ken is such a liar.
I believed you.
He ran his hands up and down her arms. Believe me about this, too, please? Her head tilted, and he noticed the dark circles under her eyes. I need to leave so you can get a little rest. He pulled her gently toward him. Are we good? She nodded. He had to accept that. Tomorrow he could tell her who called and what they wanted, but if he told her tonight, it could spoil everything they'd worked so hard for. I'll let myself out. You lock up behind me and get to bed. He'd hoped for another sweet kiss, but he didn't want an unwilling one, and he didn't want to kiss a woman who didn't trust him, so he turned to go.
Zayden?
Yeah? He looked over his shoulder. She walked slowly to him, coming around and standing in front of him. His heart just about catapulted out of his chest when she slid her arms up his chest and around his neck. Her hands threaded through his hair and her body flattened against his. He groaned.
Can I kiss you goodnight?
She whispered. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.